Today's tutor, Phoebe Hicks, took part in Portrait Artist of the Year back in 2017 when she produced a Portraiture presenter, Sue Perkins, that was full of vitality.
What's great about this is many people have said over the years you're no oil painting, and now I can say, well, I beg to differ.
Her contemporary twist on a classic style ensured that she stood out.
That's mind-blowing that they chose me. I can't believe it.
At the semi-final, her portrayal of actor Imelda Staunton was full of narrative and captivated her sitter.
I'm going to go with this painting.
As well as creating beautiful portraits of adults, Phoebe is regularly commissioned to paint children. So it's back to school with Ms. Hicks for today's masterclass, Child Portraiture.
Today, I'm going to show you how I approach a child's portrait. I'm going to be working in charcoal, which is perfect for children, as they have such soft, rounded features. I'm going to be working on a portrait of my son, Billy, who is rising to and a perfect example of all of those little nuances that you have to capture in a swiftly changing face. I'm working on a soft pastel card, and I've got a few marks here which have helped me just decide a few proportions. So I'm going to start by blocking in these marks. I'm initially going to focus on the whole size of the head. As this portrait is face on, I want to make sure I capture the silhouette well, but at the same time, I have very distinct lines, particularly around his cheeks, that I want to get right. So we'll go under the chin. I'm looking at the dark parts in the face, like in the middle of the mouth, the nostrils, and the eye. As the relationship between these three are potentially the most important, because if these three relate to each other, you will begin to have a likeness, and you will know when these start to feel off. So as some of these features are a little bit more distinctive, and I don't want to muddy the paper too much with too much charcoal, I'm going to use a piece of charcoal that I have filed a little bit more into the shape of a chisel. This will give you a little bit more control, and at the same time, it doesn't mean that you are constantly sharpening to a point. So I'm just working in to the darkest marks of the eyes. Billy has amazing, rather hooded eyes, and I want to make sure I describe this line well. So by putting this first line down, I'm going to really reference back and forth to the picture instead of just throwing it down too quickly. I took this photograph of Billy a couple of weeks ago, and I deliberately set the light up so that I had one light source. It's very easy to have multiple light sources if you're in a room filled with many windows. We're even using flash. But I think for portraiture, it really suits having one light source, particularly from a little bit higher and usually from behind the viewer. In this scenario, it has given us very lovely soft shadows around his cheeks and the shadow under his lip a little by the nose, but his face is very well lit. One thing with a child's portrait, they are attached with these ideas of being sometimes quite spooky, sometimes quite chocolate boxy, and it was one thing that drew my interest into working on children. I felt that they have such interesting, changing faces, and I wanted to find a modern look for a child's portrait. I'm going to include a few more expressive strokes, a few edgier marks, particularly around his collar. And I don't want to fluff out too much or soften too much that isn't, within his cheeks. I want to try and capture some strength because he's my strong little boy. So I'm gonna block in a little bit of the hair at this stage, just so that we have a bit more volume to work with rather than just line. As when you have just the lines to work with, it's much harder to move the structure around. When you have a block mass, you get a better idea and a better sense of the drawing as a whole, and it is easier to reference things to each other when you've got more down. So at this stage, I've started to get a bit more charcoal down, and I'm going to be really thinking about isolating the lightest part of Billy's face. It's between his eyes and his nose and his mouth. That is our focus. But there's also this lovely lighter patch on his forehead, which is really helping define that lovely round structure of his skull. And the contrast of this to his lovely fleshy cheeks is something I'd prefer to focus on. So round his cheeks, he has quite a sharp transition of light. And we know this because this shadow is darker near the edge, and it is quite quickly turning there, which means that that is a fast turning of the shape. But here it's all lovely and soft, so this is a flatter area, but we want to try and create these round, full cheeks without them looking cartoonish, without them looking too full, too flat. It's finding that level of volume that makes Billy Billy. And next, I will take my hog bristle brush and I will begin to work the charcoal into the paper. One thing I found hard with this paper is that no two pieces are the same, no colour is the same. I don't necessarily know how the marks are going to look when they're brushed into the paper. So there have been times where I felt a little bit nervous at how the marks are looking. For instance, this is now looking a cooler tone here on Billy's cheek since I've worked this in, but it is warmer here. It's very, very slight. But if I was now having to paint this, I'd be making this greener and this bluer, and the bluer to me makes it colder. So you've got sort of three tones you're working with. You've got the paper, the charcoal, and then eventually the chalk. But you've got to be aware of your hierarchy of your light. The block-in phase is usually quite aggressive, and I do it so that I can get enough charcoal on the paper to then brush in. I'm pressing pretty firmly with my paintbrush so that the charcoal is either removed or forced into the paper. You can see it begins to create a sense of volume, although none of it is very defined at this stage. So I would then take my rubber and I'd start to remove it in a few areas that I don't think charcoal will stay forever. This phase is quite a long one. There's a lot of pushing and pulling. My main focus will be at Billy's eyes, and I will go back again and again and again, rechecking the whole time about their shape and their proportion. I never settle and accept that everything is in the right place until I've finished. I'm going to put a little bit of charcoal on the bridge of his nose, which I won't necessarily leave there, but it helps me isolate and define his little nose. I've used harder charcoal much earlier in this portrait than I might in others because there is so much subtle light space to work with. And in this space, I'm going to be gently defining that shadow shape. So we've got a lovely dark shadow shape on Billy's cheek here, but this is transitioning bit by bit. And again, it's very useful to think of your head as a piece of marble that you are chipping away at. You want to think of each plane and line almost as straight or flat, and you are chipping away at it so that it turns more and more. I do find with children's portraiture that I'm particularly tough on myself. I think knowing the importance and the significance of the portrait, I have to try and be kinder to myself during the process and not rush making it perfect or making one area perfect. I have to force myself out of this need for satisfaction in the picture, and I have to accept it can be muddy and uncomfortable, and you have to sit with that and learn that is what sits beneath, and those are the important layers that you then ice and make look hopefully beautiful. Before I get too focused on the features, I'm going to add a little bit more detail to the hair at this stage, including this huge curl that sits on top like Mr. Whippy. I'm going to pull out some of these lighter marks with the rubber, and I'll just pull the charcoal off to roughly the colour of the paper, or at least enough to give it definition. As I'm making a mark with any of my tools, I'm really conscious of the movement of the line. For instance, as I'm taking charcoal off Billy's hair, I'm moving with the movement of it, the movement of the curl, thinking about which direction the light is travelling down, and all of these things are helping you create that movement of the right direction. So again, on the cheeks, almost like I'm applying a bit of blusher, I'm going to be sweeping round his cheek, not just across it, because his cheek isn't totally flat. It is luscious and round, very squeezable. I feel like I've got a good amount established that I might now consider the highlights as well as some darker accents. For the more subtle highlights and definition, I'm going to use my rubber for the chin. And this is to describe a little better the underside of his jawline. I don't need to be too precious about this because I'll go over it again. But for now, I can bounce around the rest of the picture, picking out a few accents of light. So when it comes to commissions, I've found I'm not very particular necessarily about lighting and pose, but one thing I always ask is, does that photograph look like them? Sometimes we might want a photograph of the children when they are looking their absolute best, but sometimes that's not them. If they usually have a grumpy face and they have a huge bottom lip because they're pouting, I think that's how you want to remember them, rather than this slightly sweetened version that is on the wall that, yeah, people, they're not getting a character. The character is what we want. So those things that we might think we want to avoid in a portrait are the things that I think make it the greatest. At this stage, I think it's going to be best to get the highlights in on the nose and in the eyes, and it's going to give a little bit of extra lift to the picture. So I'll start by putting my rubber into a point, and I'll dab off the exact spot I hope to put the chalk. I think I'm happy with the placement, so I'm now going to follow up with my chalk. I'm going to want to make sure it has a little bit of a point, and then I'm just going to place it in the centre and just twist it. And again, the other eye, and just twist it. I need to now start to work into his hair, because if I don't, this is going to start to get too defined and this will sort of run away. I'm going to brush this out now. This area, I mean, it feels like a mess, which wonderfully it is. It's how his hair is. I'm not going to cut it until he's 18. And I think I will just take my time. I will decide which shapes I like the most. And then I will describe a few little areas of highlight. When it comes to different hair types, I did do a portrait of Billy when he was only, I think he was about 6 months, and he was bald as a coot. So that was very much learning about how to draw the structure of a skull. And it was a really good test. But it can be easier to be drawing hair that is darker, of one block shape, because all you have to focus in on is that little highlight. And the rest of it is going to be deliciously matte and undistracting. But curls is a really good thing to play with. And it's a really good way to practice your different strokes. I'm getting to the later stages of the drawing, and I'm starting to think about things like the ears, the neck, again, going back to the hair, areas that are looking a little bit looser. I don't want to give them lots of focus and lots of detail, so I might just pull out a few things, little highlights that I think describe just enough. One thing I think could be rather lovely is that Billy has got a few extra highlights within his eyes. I'm often cautious, again, about including these sorts of things, but I think there's something rather lovely, and it could create a little bit more life. Again, that's just using a little chalk. And whilst I'm still here at the eyes, I want to really make sure I've thought about all of the slow transitions, particularly the rather wonderful hooded line. When I talk about transitioning, the transitions are the slow movement of the planes, or potentially the fast movement of the planes. So, for instance, on the bottom of Billy's lip, there is a sharp turn here. It is sharply turning away from the light. That is why we have this harsh line. In the mouth, it's a little bit different because the mouth is open, so we're seeing into the mouth. So that's not necessarily about a change of the plane. But it is happening here with his eyelid, and it's happening here with his ears. These are the sharp points. But the rest of it is pretty soft on his face. I think I might go ahead and put a little bit of chalk in his ear to describe that little bit of movement. But again, never putting too much on there. I've left the collar till quite late. It doesn't take me too long. I try to do this once my hand is a little bit warmer, and because I want to make this decision once. So I will just describe his collar in one go. I never mind about it being perfect. Now that I've established a bit of movement in the hair, I would definitely want to be working further here. But I might start thinking in the same way that I've worked with the collar, and I'm doing this with a piece of charcoal that has a finer point. I mean, this is a chisel, but the edge is sharper. And I'm gonna just describe a bit more movement. By this point, I could spend many, many hours focusing on all these soft areas. I would revisit the hair, I'd maybe have another look at this ear, but I feel like this is a really good place for my eyes to have a break, because I may come back to it and realise that this is how it's meant to be. I hope there are some tips here that you can take home and will be useful and give you that confidence to realise that a portrait of a child is easy to approach and deconstruct, and that it's not that scary once you just get going.
If you'd like to find out more about these masterclasses, go onto our website, skyartsartistoftheyear.tv.